Getting lost in the details is a distinct possibility. Have you ever been there? You got so much going on, you have so many details you have to pay attention to that you forget the big picture. Well, I'll suggest to you that what we're talking about today, the classic Palm Sunday text, is really a lesson for us about getting lost in the details. You know, one of the issues of preaching for Holy Week is that you really only get one shot at some of these texts like once a year, and this is one of them. And so you have to pick and choose what you're going to address, and sometimes you have to go through the same thing again and again. But this year I've decided that if I'm going to preach on not getting lost in the details, I thought I better help you see the big picture. So what is the big picture of Palm Sunday? What really is going on in Scripture? What is God telling us about what Jesus was about as he entered into Jerusalem with palm branches and hosannas? What really was going on? So let's see if we can find out. I'm going to read a lot, and then we're going to go relatively quickly. From the Gospel of Mark, chapter 11. As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage and Bethany at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent two of his disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and just as you enter it, you'll find a colt tied there, which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'Why are you doing this?' tell him the Lord needs it, and will send it back shortly." They went and found a colt outside on the street, tied at a doorway. As they untied it, some people standing there asked, "What are you doing untying that colt?" They answered as Jesus had told them, and the people let them go. When they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks over it, he sat on it. Many people spread their cloaks on the road, while others spread branches they had cut in the fields. Those who went ahead and those who followed shouted, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest." Jesus entered Jerusalem and went to the temple. He looked around at everything, but since it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. The next day, as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to find out if it had any fruit. When he reached it, he found nothing but leaves, because it was not the season for figs. Then he said to the tree, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard him say it. On reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple area and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, "Is it not written, 'My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations'? But you have made it a den of robbers." The chief priests and teachers of the law heard this and began looking for a way to kill him, for they feared him, because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching. When evening came, they went out of the city. In the morning as they went along, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots. So Jesus entering Jerusalem in that fashion, on the colt of a donkey, with palm branches and clothes being laid on the ground, is actually a fulfillment of a messianic passage in Zechariah 9:9. It is a fulfillment of a prophecy in the Old Testament. And those who know their Old Testament, as most of the teachers and scribes and priests would know, even most of the people would know that this is something about the Messiah. When they spread cloaks on the ground, it's something they did for conquering kings. When they saw Jesus coming, they very clearly were saying, "This is the king coming in the name of David to claim David's throne." David was the great military king who reigned over Israel in its heyday, and they were waiting for that throne to be filled again, and they saw that somehow Jesus was going to fulfill that. It's also important for us to know as background that there really was no unified messianic understanding or expectation until after 70 AD, after the temple had been destroyed. In other words, everybody had their own opinion of what the Messiah was going to be and do. There was no unified idea. The crowd was excited as Jesus approached. But it's interesting to note that if it was such a big deal, there was no response from the Romans and there was no response from chief priests and teachers of the law, which means maybe it wasn't quite that big. It maybe wasn't everybody in the area. Maybe it was a group, but it wasn't that huge. So they were excited as he entered, but then as he entered the temple, the chief priests and the teachers of the law were indifferent at best. And eventually, when they found out what he had done, oh boy, it's the breakfast that you have. If you have the wrong breakfast, that happens. What he had did, oh my goodness. Back up. When the chief priests and scribes saw what he had done, after he limited the commerce and turned tables over, that indifference turned to condemnation. And that, in turn, led to his crucifixion. There's a lot more going on here than people with palm branches singing Hosanna and it being a party. But what is it? Well, it's about people getting lost in the details. See, Jesus came to Jerusalem for a reason. It wasn't accidental. Jesus didn't do anything accidentally. We have to remember that. And when he came to Jerusalem, the first place he went was the temple. Why? Because the temple was the center of the religious faith, the religious expression of Israel. So what Jesus was doing was coming to the center of Israel, Jerusalem, and then to the center of the faith, of the experience, of the relationship of Israel to God, the temple. He looked around. Why was he looking around? What was he looking for? White glove inspection? What was he doing? He was there for a reason. It wasn't accidental. But because it was late, he left. And they went back to Bethany, and on the next morning they came back to Jerusalem, and Jesus sees a fig tree, and some people struggle with this passage. He sees a fig tree, leaves, it's not in season, and he curses it. May no one eat fruit from you again. Why would he do that? Well, it's important for us to understand that in the Old Testament, a fig tree is very often a symbolic representation of Israel. So when you talk about a fig tree in the Old Testament, very often it's talking about something to do with Israel. And that's what Jesus is doing here. See, Jesus is enacting a parable. Jesus is leading us to understand what's going to happen next. His disciples that were with him. He illustrated that as he cursed the fig tree because it was barren and fruitless, that what he was about to do in the temple was the exact same thing. Both were for the exact same reason. Because what had happened to the fig tree is going to happen to the temple. Both will be cursed because both had lots of leaves and looked like they should be bearing fruit, but weren't. What happened to that tree happened to the temple in 70 A.D. When the Romans came and tore it down in 13:2, in Mark 13:2, it says, "Not one stone will be left on another." And that's exactly what happened. The Romans were thorough in their destruction of the temple. But that wasn't what ended the temple. Jesus' judgment on the temple is what ended it. See, the temple wasn't bearing fruit. What does that mean? It means that the temple wasn't bearing heart-changing, authentic worship in the people. It had become about externals. It had become about what the Pharisees were prioritizing. It had become about paying attention to minutia and getting lost in the details, so much so that we miss the big picture. We miss the real point of what God is all about. And what God is all about is not the observance of minute details. He's not about the list of do's and don'ts. He's about the salvation of people, the freeing of hearts, the transformation of lives. And that's what had happened, is that they got so wrapped up in the details, in their daily lives, in their temple worship, in how they were approaching God, that they missed the entire point of what God was doing. How do we know that? They missed the Messiah. They were so wrapped up in the details of what they were expecting and what they wanted God to do, they missed the one He sent to save them. The people on the road, what were they expecting? Well, as I said, there was no unified expectation of the Messiah, and as tends to happen with crowds, with lots of enthusiasm, everybody tends to come with their own agenda. Everybody tends to come with their own thing that they're waiting for, they're looking for, they want from this Messiah. And we've talked about this in years past, and maybe you've heard. Some wanted the political oppression freed. Some wanted to be freed from the yoke of Rome. Some wanted Him to be the military hero to conquer the nations around them. But there were others, as in John chapter 6, that were following Him, and Jesus said, "You're following me because you want a free meal." And when the teaching got hard, when Jesus said, "You need to eat my flesh and drink my blood, you need to recognize that I am the sacrifice, the only sacrifice for your sin, and you need to do that," they said, "This is a hard teaching." And they stopped following Him. Everybody who was standing there, waving palm branches, throwing clothes on the road, had an expectation of what this Messiah was going to do for them. And the one that's mentioned in the text is that they expected Him to take up the throne of David, which was a military conquering hero. The problem was, as Anthony has already said, the conquering that needed to be done wasn't political or military powers. It was the sin in Israel's life. It was the sin in the hearts of the people. What Jesus came to do, and what He was saying to anyone who had eyes to see and ears to hear, is that the judgment of God had come, and it came in Him. He condemned the faithlessness and the fruitlessness of the people, and He condemned the faithlessness and the fruitlessness of the temple. And the fig tree was His enacted parable to show the disciples what was happening. Because Jesus Himself fulfills the function, fulfills all of the purposes of the temple. See, Jesus is the one who fulfilled all of it. He's the cornerstone upon which the New Testament people, the New Covenant people are built. And we are built into the temple of God. We are the temple of God now, built on the chief cornerstone, Jesus Christ. And so although He figuratively tears down the temple, He replaces it. The physical temple becomes the spiritual temple, and it's the conversion, it's the transition from the old to the new, and the recognition that the temple that was fruitless will now be fruitful. Why did He come? He came because He's the Messiah. He brings judgment on Israel in the temple. The cleansing act that Jesus performed was prophetic. He was illustrating that the fruitlessness is going to end, and that judgment is going to fall on Israel, because the Messiah is the fulfillment and the replacement of the temple. His death and resurrection, not the temple practices, not the ritual, is the perfect atonement for sin. And that was God's plan. So although the people were excited, they were enthusiastic admirers of this person coming into Jerusalem because they thought they knew what He was about, they missed the big picture because they were wrapped up in the little details of their agendas. And God's plan is always bigger than our agenda. Jesus said it in John 2:19. He said to those who asked, destroy this temple, and I'll raise it again in 3 days. See, Jesus very clearly said, I am the temple. That building isn't the temple anymore. I'm the temple. Jesus came to accomplish God's purposes, not man's. And so those who should have recognized him were too wrapped up in the details of what they wanted to see God's picture unfolding in front of them. In other words, they were lost in the details of their own agendas. They were literally lost in the details of their own agendas. Folks, do you know that it's possible to be lost in the details of your own agenda? It is. See, if we aren't willing to see God's purpose and God's plan, if we hold on so tightly to what we want and only what we want, that we miss His purpose, there's great danger that we will be lost. It's very important for us to understand that just going through the motions and just paying attention to ritual, just showing up, isn't what God asks. It's very important for us to grasp at this point in our lives that sitting in church, even for 40 years, does not save you. We must come to the point where we recognize that in God's big plan, He didn't say, I want you to do this and not do that. He didn't say, I want you to be nice people. He didn't say, I have come to make you look great in the eyes of everybody around you. He said, I came so you could give me everything that you are. And that's what I want, everything. Heart, mind, soul, body, pocketbook, family, marriage, community, everything. I want it all. And by the way, I also don't abide competitors, because I'm not a smorgasbord item that you can just put on your tray along with lots of other nice, touchy-feely things. It's all Jesus or not Jesus. Those are His terms. I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. No one. How about you? You trying to get in another way? Is Jesus just one more little thing that you've added to your nice religious spiritual tray? So He balances out everything, kind of the feng shui of your cafeteria tray? Does it make your spiritual life feel nice and balanced? Sorry, that's not the point. It's very easy to get lost in the details and miss the big picture of what God is up to. I pray that that's not you. So what? Well, don't miss the big picture. You know, one of the things that we tend to all be guilty of at different times of our lives is that we tend to think that God's agenda is my agenda. I'm sorry, that's not really true. He is all about transforming us so that our agendas more accurately reflect His, but my agenda is not necessarily God's, and we have to be willing to recognize that. Jesus came to accomplish God's purposes, not mine. As noble and wonderful and world-changing as my agenda may be, He came to fulfill God's agenda and not mine. And it's important for us to distinguish the difference. At a leadership level, we would call that recognizing our shadow missions, right? God's mission versus our mission, which is a shadow mission. We do it kind of because we're not aware of it, or it's really kind of a secondary thing that we've made a primary thing. Like popularity can be a shadow mission. Forming crowds can be a shadow mission. Having the best show in town can be a shadow mission. There are lots of shadow missions. And I'll suggest to you that the people who are waving the palm branches and throwing their clothes on the ground, many of them had a shadow mission that day. And that was to get Jesus to do what they wanted him to do. It's a life-changing moment when we recognize that we're all about what God wants to accomplish, and that God is not all about what we want him to accomplish. So when we get on his agenda, things start to change. And when I say things, I mean we start to change. Because his purpose is to change us. And if we follow him, if we are diligent in seeking to be on his agenda, pursuing his big purposes, we will bear much fruit. And finally, this is a sermon for another day, but Jesus isn't looking for fans, folks. He's not looking for enthusiastic admirers who yell, Hosanna, Hosanna, yay, Jesus, go, Jesus. He's not looking for fans. He calls followers. Fans, enthusiastic admirers, follow when it goes well. But when the harsh words come, when the difficult concepts are presented, when things get rough, they say, this is too hard, I'm not doing this anymore. And they turn away. Followers follow no matter what. Because the difference is commitment, not comfort. So the question, fans or followers, in the words of Kyle Idleman, fans or followers, what are we? Are we committed to God's big picture? Are we really about what God is trying to accomplish in our world, in us, through us? That's the question of the week. Are we really about his purposes or ours with his stamp on it? That's the question of the week. Are we willing to go there, even if it's uncomfortable? Are we willing to go there, even if not everybody likes where we're going? I pray we'll find out.